Hi, this is Heidi Morrissey, and this is my report on the research that I conducted for this class regarding the use of L1 in the English language classroom. So, some background information. I am currently a Spanish teacher, hoping to transition to an English language teaching position in the near future. So, I wanted to use my knowledge of second language acquisition and the rules that I know about using L1 in the classroom and compare those to the English language classroom and whether or not there is acceptable use of the native language in the classroom, both in instruction and between students. I know that in teaching Spanish, I am asked to teach 90% of my classroom time in the target language, which is very difficult at lower proficiency levels. And so I'm comparing that 90% rule to some of the English only rules that I have read about in different English language programs and whether or not those are truly serving students, again, specifically at the lower proficiency levels. Are there L1 benefits regardless of the native language? In other words, even if the teacher doesn't share the same L1 with students, are there benefits to allowing L1 students who have the same L1? Are there benefits to allowing them to collaborate in the classroom while learning a new language? And then how to accommodate L1 use if there is no shared L1. So these were the sort of my personal interests as I went into my research. So the guiding questions that I used in the research were, what does the research say about how L1 use affects L2 acquisition? Is it practical to teach L2 without some L1 use? Are English only policies beneficial to student learning? How does L1 use in the classroom actually improve student learning? And is L1 use viewed differently when the language being studied is not English? The research itself was quite diverse. So, of the research articles that I read, 40% of them came from Asia or took place within Asian universities. 30% were from the US. I had an article from Canada, one that took place in Colombia, and then a couple in Europe as well. The languages being studied in the studies that I read were primarily English, 80% of them. But then I also read a couple of studies where German was the target language, and one where Japanese was the target language, and one where Spanish was the language being studied. And in terms of the types of classrooms, there were, in the studies that I read, English classrooms where English is the native language, which is similar to what we would see K through 12 in our ESL programs. Foreign language classrooms where English is the native language, which is where I fall right now in my professional position, being a Spanish teacher, sharing English as the native language with my students. And then English classrooms where English is not the native language, such as Saudi Arabia, where the native language is Arabic, but the language being taught is English. The time frame of my studies, primarily 7 of my studies took place within the last 3 years. 9 of them took place between 2011 and 2020. And then I did keep a couple of older studies in my list because I felt like they added a little bit of chronological perspective in terms of what was happening in 1985 in terms of language teaching and how that progressed throughout the 90s and the early 2000s as classrooms became more proficiency oriented and less translation / direct method. So some of the general observations I had are that English only rules exist and are very common outside of the US in the classrooms. Most of the research was at the university level. Lack of teacher training was a common complaint. English proficiency in several Asian countries is far below expectation. In one of my studies, students, the subjects had studied English from age 5 through the end of secondary school and were currently in the first year of university and were still considered to be at a novice level proficiency. And then another factor that came up in a lot of the studies was the fact that strict pacing and curriculum, which is set by the Ministry of Education in many countries, is what leads teachers to use L1 because they don't have any flexibility within their curriculum and they must cover a tremendous amount of information in a short period of time. Therefore, it is just simpler to give students that information in L1. So some key takeaways, I put those into 3 categories: teacher perspectives, the top 5 uses for L1, and then student benefits. So teacher perspectives, many times the word judicious came up as being the term that describes how much L1 should be used in an L2 classroom. Most teachers surveyed agreed that it's not ideal to be teaching in the first language, but it is the reality. If you share a language with your students, it is often necessary to use that language to communicate efficiently and accurately. Using L1 is not really possible in a heterogeneous classroom, which is similar to what I might have in my district, where we represent over 65 different languages in our program. And finally, that teachers worry that they might be overusing L1 when they share an L1 with their students. As in my case, where if I'm simply looking to communicate something quickly and efficiently, I will just use English to do that, because taking the time to explain the vocabulary in Spanish is not a good use of time with a large number of students. So the top 5 reasons for using first language in the classroom, and this came up in multiple articles. Number 1, classroom management. Number 2, classroom discipline. 3 is to clarify content and make sure that to prevent any misunderstandings, to teach new vocabulary, and to teach grammar. So some of the benefits to students for allowing students to be in a second language environment or a third language environment, whatever number that is, but some benefits to them allowing them to use L1 would be that it does help to reduce anxiety, because they see their native language as an acceptable and beneficial part of their cultural background. It can allow for peer scaffolding. If you have two Turkish speakers in your classroom, one's at a intermediate level of English proficiency and one is a newcomer, you can pair them in lots of situations, and they actually will be able to work together and improve their English growth, as well as develop a relationship between the two of them. Cultural background, being appreciated, is so important by showing children that you appreciate their L1, that you want to know more about it and how it works and what are some of the words. Those are things that go a long way in building relationships. The simple fact of acknowledging that students who already have another language, that's an asset, that's not a deficit. Being an English learner is an asset, it's not a deficit. These kids come in and they have an extra mental challenge or cognitive load that most of our other students do not have. And that makes them superhuman in a lot of ways. And then also another reason to allow students, or a benefit to students for allowing them to use their native language, would be the fact that their native language gives them some funds of linguistic knowledge that they can apply to their new language learning. It helps them to be use meta-language skills to incorporate the new knowledge into the language framework that's already wired into their brains. So for pedagogical implications, I've simply pulled some observations from some of the reports that I read. Exclusive use of English only in the class may be detrimental to effective L2 teaching and learning. The appropriate quantity of L1 used by teachers cannot be defined universally as a fixed percentage, because it is inseparably linked to the underlying function or purpose. Students mediate their understanding through accessing their funds of linguistic knowledge. Many of the participants perceive that a judicious use of L1 is always beneficial. Using L1 can stimulate collaborative dialogue among L2 learners. And these were just some of the things that stood out to me. Finally, using L1 in the L2 classroom has fruitful effects, as evidenced by the findings, and ignoring this fact is not helpful. I really enjoyed doing the research for this class. I feel like I learned a lot about English teaching. I learned a lot about my own language teaching. And if you're interested in seeing any of the articles or my annotated bibliographies, feel free to scan the QR code there, and that will take you to a folder where you can review the resources. Thank you very much.